up. But I suppose in the interest of time, you can get going. We could get going now.
There's a lot of people joining now, actually. So
great, cool. Super. We can give it another few minutes just to wait until everybody's joined before we kick off properly. Anyway, at least. So in the interest of time,
I was just being a bit premature. Sorry.
That's no bother. I'm excited too. It's fine.
We'll get going in a minute or two now, everyone. Cheers for coming along.
Okay, we might get going there. I'm sure we've got a few viewers on YouTube and Facebook as well. But yeah, thanks everybody for coming to our public meeting on eco-socialism. And thanks very much to Adrian and Jess for their time. So yeah, hopefully it'll be a good night. And just for those that weren't here at the start, I was just saying that this meeting will be recorded. So if either Mike or Denman could record this, then that would be super. And then people can watch it back if they want. So if you do ask a question, you'll be recorded in that sense, but it will only be going on up on Facebook and Twitter afterwards for people to watch back. So yeah, and if you do want to ask any questions throughout, just feel free to raise your hand, and then one of us can ask you to unmute, and you can ask it, or you can pop it in the chat, and then I can ask it to our speakers. So yeah. Without further ado, then I will introduce our speakers. So we have Jess Spear here. So Jess is the national organizer of Rise, an editor of Rupture magazine, and a former climate scientist specializing in paleoceanography. So she's also a member of the Global Eco-Socialist Network. So very warm welcome to Jess. Thanks very much for your time. And then we also have Adrian here as well, who is our local representative for People Before Profit Galway, an eco-socialist activist and a student. So yeah, we'll start. I'm going to ask Jess a couple of questions to begin, and then we'll move on to Adrian, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So Jess, first things first, I suppose the basic question, what is eco-socialism? And would you mind touching on some of the kind of big discussions within eco-socialism, such as growth and degrowth, if you don't mind?
I don't mind. I'm super happy to be here. Thanks so much to the Galway People Before Profit branch for inviting me to come out, and thanks everybody for coming to yet another Zoom meeting and spending some time tonight. I think it's a really good question because lots of people would answer it in lots of different ways, but I would answer it by using something that Fred Hampton said, firstly. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Fred Hampton, he was an extremely talented organizer for the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. And he said that socialism is the people. Socialism is about giving the people who have no power in society, the workers, the poor, the indigenous, the peasants, power. And by that, you take ownership and control over the resources, the technology, and the wealth that we are collectively creating. And that is so that instead of a tiny elite being at the top, hoarding everything and destroying us and nature to enrich themselves, we can produce for our needs and our desires and build a society that allows us to flourish and explore our creative pursuits. Eco-socialism is about putting nature into that question or equation. So if socialism is the people, eco-socialism is the people and nature. So we're a part of nature. We've just been separated from it through dispossession, exploitation, and oppression. And eco-socialism recognizes that we need nature to thrive. We need a stable climate and healthy ecosystems. And we say that you can't separate out the question of climate change and biodiversity loss from wages and jobs and housing, sexism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia. You can't separate it from war or genocide or any of that. If we want to fight for a better life, for a better society, we have to deal with all of that because it affects all us working class and poor people. One of the questions that increasingly comes up amongst eco-socialists is the whole growth and degrowth debate. So I think it would be helpful maybe to touch a little bit on that to expand on the kind of eco-socialism that I'm in favor of, but it is an ongoing debate. So I think the question of growth and degrowth kind of talk past each other sometimes, and I don't want to mischaracterize the growth argument, but I do think sometimes there can be a false dichotomy between the two. So growth proponents are concerned about raising living standards amongst the very poor and believe that socialists cannot stand for austerity. We can't stand for less. We can't stand for degrowing things. We have to be for progress. We have to be for growth. But advocates for degrowth, which I am one, are also concerned with raising the living standards of the very poorest and are not for austerity. So degrowth is about shrinking or eliminating harmful industries like the weapons industry and fossil fuels, advertisement, luxury items like yachts and private jets, as well as getting rid of like planned obsolescence, where your cellular phone is planned to be replaced every 2 years or so. All kinds of goods are made that way, rather than being made to be durable and to last as long as possible, and then also to be easily recycled. They're made to be completely obsolete as quickly as possible and just tossed into the bin. And I would use Jason Hickel here, and I would quote something he says, because I think he says it really well. He says, quote, degrowth is about reducing excess resource and energy throughput, while at the same time improving human well-being and social outcomes. From the perspective of ecology, this is what matters, unquote. And there's all kinds of things that we can do that are going to reduce resources and energy use, but will also raise living standards. And I give an example, like decommodifying public services and making them freely available. like public transport. Like it costs a lot of money to own and operate a car, but we need to get around, you know? Personal car use produces huge amounts of emissions. It is actually the fastest rising part of the transport sector's emissions is individual car use. So investing heavily in public services under common ownership and control reduces energy needs, reduces emissions, reduces deaths, both human and animal, as well as making it easier for us to get around. I think growth advocates, to be honest, I think they have not come to terms with the very real limitations to resource and energy use. You know, we can always develop new technology to use, you know, our resources and energy more efficiently, but ultimately we do need to degrow many industries and transform production to be based on what we need, not what creates profits.
That's great. That's a very, very good answer there. Very clear. So the next question, I have some questions about that, but I'll save it for the floor at the end. But the next question I have here then is, what would you say the biggest difference is between eco-socialism and, we'll say, the Green Party's policies and the Green Party's approach to addressing climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there are two things which are related. Firstly, we're for socialism. You know, we're for overthrowing this system that's based on exploiting workers, oppressing women, people of color, LGBTQ people, travelers, and destroying nature. And we're for building an eco-socialist society along the lines of what I was talking about before. The Green Party is not for socialism. They believe that we can solve climate change and the biodiversity crisis, homelessness, sexism, racism, all of that within the current capitalist system. And I have no doubt that there are Green Party members who don't think that, who are for socialism. But by and large, that's their outlook. And it's clear from the approach that they take to like bringing about change. And that brings me to the second point of difference. You know, we have different approaches to bringing about reforms, both big and small. I remember in Tala, we had a debate. Paul Murphy had a debate with Eamon Ryan a few years ago about, you know, how can you solve climate change? And I could see Dave smiling because he was there, you know. And Eamon Ryan very clearly said, you know, that he had confidence. He had confidence in the Dáil. He had confidence in parliamentary systems to bring about the change that we need, which I found shocking considering how long parliaments have been dragging their feet on climate change. I do not have confidence in parliaments. I don't have confidence in the Dáil. Like, sure, the Dáil voted for repeal in the end, but it was women and the movement they built over decades that got repeal and legislation for choice. Every single right that we have, you know, from like the weekend and the 8-hour day, minimum wages, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, environmental regulations, like it was not parliaments that brought that about. It was working people, young people that put it on the agenda and demanded that change. And I think even if you look at something like the EU, where the EU, in the case of Ireland, like it'll bring a case against Ireland and demand that Ireland takes better care of its environment. These regulations, and even like the idea that you just don't dump toxic waste into the ocean, you don't just pollute at will, all of that is because ordinary people campaigned and fought for it. Those regulations wouldn't exist otherwise. The EU itself isn't some source of progressive legislation or regulations to protect the environment. It was people power campaigns and movements that brought that about. I mean, I think you'd have to be pretty naive to think that like sexism can be legislated away and that we can bring in legislation to end the gender pay gap and so on. You know, you'd be really naive to think that you can just kind of like bring in quotas to diversify our leaderships and boardrooms and somehow that's going to bring the change that we need to end racism. But I think like you'd have to be incredibly naive to think that capitalism, which has known about climate change for decades now, is somehow going to allow legislation to outlaw trillions in fossil fuel assets. I think you have to be incredibly naive. And we're fast approaching tipping points. We need movements now more than ever to halt biodiversity loss and emissions. And parliaments are not going to do that. Only working people with our collective power in our communities, but most importantly in our workplaces where we create all that wealth that they're hoarding at the top. Only by us demanding and shutting down this system will bring that about. And that doesn't mean that we don't work in parliaments. Of course we do, but they are primarily platforms used to build the people power movements that are the real force capable of changing society. The Green Party, like, I think they have like a hyper focus on policy. You know, you have a policy for this and that, and like it's super important to get a certain policy in place, but policy has to get passed. Like you have to get enough support for it, and you have to bring enough pressure to bear to get something passed. And the question for people before profit, for eco-socialists, is, you know, not about like the most perfect policy. It's about how can we actually win change. And it's obviously helpful to have policy suggestions. We have them. We put them forward all the time, despite what the media would have you think. But we are more focused on building the self-organization and confidence of ordinary people to fight for the change that they want to see. I mean, we're not looking to like put forward some policy and go into a back room with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and you get it watered down to be almost meaningless and like have to stand over a bunch of attacks on workers and women just to get a small little policy change. So, you know, we have very broad differences in terms of like where we're headed, but also how are we going to get the change that we know that we need.
Yeah, that's the point about the debate between Paul Murphy and Eamon Ryan, I think really underscores the kind of crucial difference in that, about the, I suppose, the reliance and commitment to constitutional methods to bring about that change. But yeah, a fantastic answer. Thank you very much for that. So yeah, I wanted to ask then, are there any examples of, or what are some of the major examples, I suppose, of eco-socialist policies being implemented? And where do green job programs and care jobs fall into those frameworks? If you could comment on that for a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question, I think, because I wouldn't want people to think, oh, you know, we're just fighting for something that's far distant into the future. We are fighting for change in the here and now. And I guess, like, if you want to ask the question of like, where do you see policies implemented? My answer would be all over, but only partially implemented. So for example, just I think this week or maybe late last week, Spain announced the pilot program for the 4-day working week without loss of pay. And the government's going to financially support businesses to test out reducing work hours with no loss in pay. And that's a policy that we absolutely advocate here in Ireland, that we should be working less to reduce emissions, to reduce the amount of pressure on families with no loss in pay. Another example would be Luxembourg, and around 100 cities have free public transport. That's another policy that we advocate. Universal and free public services, there's lots of examples that you could look at, but particularly with healthcare, you look at the UK, Sweden, Germany, they're not perfect, and they're not exactly what we would call for. Like, we'd want workers in these industries, as well as the communities that they serve, to control and manage how that healthcare is happening, to democratically plan it, but they are universal public services. We would go much further on childcare. You know, we would want community canteens, community laundromats, all of that. But the fact that you do have universal public and free services in many, many countries, it shows it can be done, and the outcomes are starkly different when you compare it to countries like the US, where I'm from, where healthcare is private. And, you know, even if you have health insurance and you've been paying out of pocket, like, for this health insurance, you can still be in a situation where you don't get the care that you need, and you die because the cost is so high. Another one that I'd point to is eco-socialists are for workers owning and controlling industry. And if you look at in the Basque Country of the Spanish state, you have the Mondragon Cooperative. It's a worker-owned cooperative where the workers and the managers share in the profits of the company. And the managers basically, they make no more than around 5 times more than the lowest paid employee, in contrast to like the CEO worker ratio in many businesses being many, many times that, and upwards of like 300 to 1 in some situations. But this cooperative, you know, it has to operate within capitalism, has to get raw materials and supplies in supply chains to produce its products. So it ends up resting on the exploitation of workers in other countries and workers in other industries that are not in a worker cooperative. So it's limited, it's partial. Another thing that I'd point to is efforts towards regenerative farming. This is an eco-socialist policy that you'd want to see expanded upon. Again, there's lots of examples, but unfortunately, most of them are happening on privately held land. They're not run democratically by a community or anything, but the results from regenerative farming and in some cases rewilding show the potential for us to have a more harmonious relation with nature, and that ecosystems can thrive alongside what we need in terms of food production. But like I would say that these policies in and of themselves, they're not eco-socialism. You know, they point to a society and an economy that's organized for people, for their well-being, and they end up harming nature less because the end goal is not profit accumulation by any means. It's not planned obsolescence, as I talked about before, but durable goods and good outcomes for people. But you know, it's not socialism. They're still operating in a capitalist system, and that reduces the impact that they could have. But nonetheless, you know, the positive outcomes show the potential that exists. And lastly, I'd say, like, ultimately, the main eco-socialist policy we don't see and we won't see until we have a revolution is the ending of private property rights and the hoarding of resources, and bringing the economy into democratic public ownership and control. I mean, if you just look at the vaccine situation, it's so obvious that it shouldn't be owned and sold for profit, but yet it is. And it's the same with land, technology, machinery, energy. All of that should be in the hands of the people so that we can make a plan together. I guess, yeah, to touch on the green jobs aspect, like, I think for a lot of people, green jobs, it just, you immediately think of like energy and retrofitting. And these are usually very male jobs, and we need them. We need more wind turbines, we need solar panels, we need to retrofit. Nearly every single home in Ireland needs to be retrofitted. But for me, green jobs also includes care jobs. And by this, I mean like education, healthcare, childcare, elderly care. And these are not only vital to the running of society and the health of society, but they're also low carbon jobs. And so to me, green jobs also includes care jobs. And they are things that we need a massive investment in anyway, but also by massively investing in them, you're also reducing other industries, you're reducing the carbon emissions. They're also overwhelmingly done by women and are often either unpaid or underpaid and undervalued, and usually done by migrant women. So any green jobs program should be including a massive investment in these industries, not only to reduce emissions, but also to deal with the gender pay gap, to lift the burden off of women and off of families, to ensure that, you know, we can lead healthy lives, but also that we reduce the impact on women and allow them to play a greater role in society and a greater role in the transition.
Yeah, that's it's great to even hear you highlight some of the, I suppose, some of the policies that maybe are not full on socialist as we would like, but whose intentions and outcomes are quite positive. Because I think something that's leveled overwhelmingly against socialism generally is that it's unrealistic. Everybody wants this, but either you can't do it or it won't work. And it's you know, it's nice to just hear that kind of debunked as well. And yeah, so, you know, thanks very much for that. Yeah, so I also wanted to ask then about whether or not you could speak a bit about ecofeminism and where that falls into eco-socialism. I think you touched on it a little bit with the importance of kind of targeting and supporting care jobs, particularly unpaid care. And yeah, so could you talk a little bit about ecofeminism, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So ecofeminism, it looks at like why women and nature are both subordinated and exploited. You know, why are women valued less than men? Why is nature not valued at all? And where does that come from? Like, what's that rooted in? Why is society that way? But there are different strands of thought within ecofeminist theory and different answers to those questions. So I just touch on the two main ones. The first one is what I would call a more essentialist tendency. And this one kind of looks at women's reproductive biology and says this is why women have an affinity with nature, because of our fertility. And they tend to blame like kind of this overarching kind of undefined patriarchy, where because men don't have this biological connection to nature, then they pillage and destroy more easily. I don't want to mischaracterize what people are saying here, but I do think that this tendency within ecofeminism is a little problematic. Not a little, actually, it's very problematic. When you consider like second wave feminism, you know, in the 60s and the 70s, we're absolutely fighting back against the idea that our biology should determine our role in society. And you know, that like our biology in any way says anything about us at all. And I also would point out, like, it's extremely problematic when you consider our trans brothers and sisters and non-binary comrades. Like, it leaves them out completely. Like, what role do they have and what affinity do they have, and where are they in this overall analysis over why women and nature are subordinated and dominated? The other tendency is the Marxist tendency within ecofeminism that does not agree that it's our biology which is what connects us to nature. Instead, they look at kind of the systemic and material reasons why women in nature are not valued in capitalism, and why historically women have been forced into certain roles in families, in society. You know, the unpaid labor we are disproportionately responsible for that I mentioned earlier, and also how this gender division of labor in society and the non-valuing of nature, both of those things together prop up capitalism. Like, the unpaid labor that women do within the home was calculated by Oxfam, I think last year or the year before it, like 11 billion. Like, it's a huge gift that you're giving capitalism, that it doesn't have to pay for these things. And it's the same with nature. Like, it doesn't value it. It sees it as a free gift. So these things allow capitalism to profit. And it means that, you know, capitalism is propped up year after year. It's reproduced year after year. The profits are flowing. And people grow up in a culture of gender norms that kind of act as a pipeline to certain roles, and on until we fight back against that, as you're seeing, you know, throughout the whole history of capitalism, but most importantly over the past 10 years in terms of trans people and non-binary people fighting back against gender norms. And that strengthens the women's movement. You know, as a Marxist, like, I would absolutely agree with the second one and not with the former, because I think as an eco-socialist, you know, we need to find ways of bringing together our demands around climate justice and biodiversity loss with our demands to end sexism in all its forms. And that's why, to me, like, the green jobs program issue that I talked about before, you have to also bring in your analysis around sexism. You also have to bring in your analysis in terms of class, so that you can, you know, put forward a vision of a society that addresses the issues that are impacting the vast majority of people on the planet and the people that are most marginalized and oppressed.
Yeah, that's great. And I particularly like, though, the kind of, you know, I guess I don't want to show my bias too much either, but the classical ecofeminist kind of almost like a reductionary sense, you know, equating the reason that women and nature are so intertwined by purely, you know, biological reasons. I do think that's incredibly exclusionary. So it's great to hear that touched on in kind of a broader Marxist sense as well, about kind of being a socially constructed relationship. But yeah, really, really great answer. Thank you very much. So with that, I think we're, for now anyway, I'm sure we'll have questions from the floor for Jess, but we will move on to Adrian and ask him a couple of questions if he's ready to go there. So thanks very much, Jess, as well, for your time. Some great answers there, and I'm sure there will be some discussion afterwards as well on a couple of those points. So Adrian, could you speak a little bit about what local issues in Galway could benefit from an eco-socialist approach?
Yeah, sure. I just want to say thanks for everyone coming along, and thanks, Jess, for that. That was fascinating. So the first thing that came to mind for me when I was trying to maybe apply eco-socialism to some Galway issues, and it'll probably become obvious as I go on why, is transport issues in Galway. So I'm going to talk a bit about that to start with. So I know some of you here aren't from Galway, but hopefully a good few of you are. the ones who are will be aware that like since or before COVID, traffic was at crisis levels in Galway. It really was a crisis. I worked in Parkmore Industrial Estate for almost a decade, and like that's probably the most congested part of the city, and apparently Galway is the most congested city of our size in Europe. The cities who are comparable are, you know, many times our size of population. So it really was getting to chronic levels. I started off saying it has lessened because of lockdown and everything, but I actually read a report today that traffic in Galway is 40% higher now than it was in lockdown last year, which is probably a topic for a whole other meeting about how this isn't really lockdown and we're not really eliminating COVID, but I'll skip over that. So these chronic traffic congestion levels in Galway, obviously bad for people's quality of life, spending time sitting in their car, bad for our health, air quality, and point of this meeting is terrible for the planet, carbon emissions. So in terms of solutions to this problem, we have this kind of mantra of build the bypass rammed down our throats. If people remember Fianna Fáil's, Ollie Crow's election posters, big giant posters with build the bypass on them, that then during the campaign got changed to ones that said our smart green city after some polling suggested people weren't really into building the bypass. So this has been on for years, this build the bypass as a solution to everything. And the planning decision on it from On Board Pleola is actually due next month finally, although there'll be appeals either way, I'm sure. So just to look at some of the details of the plan, it's going to cost at least, if it goes ahead, 600 million euro. It's going to be 12 kilometres of motorway, dual carriageway and single carriageway, and it'll involve a new bridge being constructed over the River Corrib. And so basically onto the PPP and eco-socialism perspective on this, that more cars, more roads, more emissions aren't the solution. It's outdated thinking. It's, you know, 1970s style car-centric planning, and it's discredited basically. There's research from around the world that shows that building more roads doesn't solve congestion. It means more cars on the road and more congestion and more carbon emissions. There's a thing called induced demand, which is basically where if a new road is built and it induces you to start driving to work because it makes it quicker for you, it means that'll also happen for other people will be induced to drive on the road. So this new road will just lead to there being more cars on the road, more congestion, more emissions. This has been shown around the world when new roads are built. So it's not going to ease or lower congestion and emissions. It's going to increase them. So basically, if this road is built, it's going to turn out to be an expensive, long, drawn-out disaster, really, for Galway. Not going to solve the problem. So our solution then would be, well, it would include public transport, as Jess touched on, free public transport, we would say. I'll get into that in a minute. Improved walking and cycling infrastructure, and I suppose better planning so that you know, people can avoid having to drive to work and this kind of thing. So first one of those is basically we need massive investment in public transport to reduce the number of the cars on the road. We don't need to build, you know, more roads. PPP have had the proposal of making public transport free costed, and it really doesn't cost a lot more than the current system of subsidised public transport. And it has worked in other cities, as Jess mentioned, like Dunkirk in France and in Luxembourg and elsewhere. And, you know, like, I think people tend to recoil a bit at the idea of just making public transport free. It sounds unrealistic or something. But like, as I said, it has worked elsewhere, and we have other public services for free. You know, we have public parks and libraries and so on. So as well as this, obviously needs to be expanded from the current system, you know, right across the city and county and across the country. You know, more and better bus routes. In Galway, for example, currently in Galway City, every single bus route goes to and from Eyre Square, which is a ridiculous situation. So that's just ploughing buses right in the middle of the city centre. So we would be in favour of democratic planning of public transport routes. So basically, they're running where and when people need them. This is both to get to work and school and college, and also, interestingly, a report I read from Transport Infrastructure Ireland talked about how generally public transport is designed with men in mind, basically getting men to work and where they need to go, but it doesn't really take into account the needs of women who generally have the most care responsibilities. So like trips that aren't about getting themselves to work or wherever they're going, but are about picking up and dropping off, either children or adults who they care for. So that situation is never really taken into account in public transport. So those people generally are forced to drive because they have no other option. So that's something we need to take into consideration when we're hopefully investing in and expanding our public transport. I read as well that public transport can be 45 times more efficient than private cars in terms of emissions per person. So I mean, that speaks for itself, really. The other thing that I say about Galway in particular is that when we say public transport, we mean public, not privatized, because we had a situation in Galway City last year where the biggest suburb of Galway City was left without public transport at all for 6 months because the bus routes that cover that area have been privatized, and when the capacity in buses was reduced because of social distancing, the company just stopped running because it wasn't profitable for them to run with reduced capacity. And there was absolutely nothing done about this. Eamon Ryan was actually in Galway for a photo op during these 6 months, despite the travel restrictions, and didn't speak anything about it, didn't show any interest in the situation at all. So then, just to wrap up on this, I'm probably going on a bit. Aside from buses, we also would support light rail for Galway. There's a Lewis campaign group who've been doing great work on this. There's a feasibility study that showed that Galway would be suitable for light rail. But again, when this study published its findings, it was put to Eamon Ryan, and he basically put the whole idea to bed. Again, no real interest. And then finally on this, I just say that a year or two ago, we in PVP Galway ran a campaign to get bus fares in Galway reduced to €1 for the month of December. We would have seen this as kind of a stepping stone to convince people of the benefits of making public transport free. And our argument was that people are going into town anyway in December, Christmas shopping and going out and going for dinner and all that. And that, reducing the price of bus fares for the month would have had benefits for everybody, for the people traveling, for local businesses, and for the environment, for the planet. Reduced cars on the road, reduced emissions. Unfortunately, the National Transport Authority turned us down on that, but it's something we're going to revisit. They told us that their promotional budget for the year was spent, but I mean, we tried to make the argument that it would have actually increased their revenue, not decreased it, we believed. It's something we'll definitely revisit after the pandemic, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks. No, thanks very much for all of that. That's very, very interesting. I like as well, I suppose I note the kind of recoil from these policies that are supposedly unrealistic, that have, kind of vast swaths of research backing them up, kind of globally. I just think that's pretty interesting, just how deep rooted that the aversion to, kind of free public services is in that respect. So yeah. So kind of you having already touched a little bit, I suppose, on Ollie Crow, do you have any faith in the local politicians to actually take meaningful steps towards change at all? Or are you, I know the answer, I think, but yeah.
I see someone else is laughing as well. No. What's the next question? No. Yeah, I really wouldn't, for a number of reasons. Like, there was a situation last summer where there was COVID mobility funding, I think it's called, available to all the local councils. And a public consultation went live on this, and there was overwhelming support in Galway for a cycle lane to be installed along the prom and through Salt Hill there. Like, there was hundreds of submissions calling for it, and funding was ready and waiting to go. The council were going to install it until a group of local businesses in Salt Hill got together and just pressurized the councillors, and the plan was just pulled, and there is still no cycle lane there. And like, the point of me telling that story isn't that cycle lanes are the holy grail, you know. I'm not in the Green Party, but my point is that if they can't do something so simple when there's funding and a plan ready and waiting to go and overwhelming public support for it, and still they just bend over backwards to placate a few businesses, like, what faith do you have in them and taking any meaningful action down the road, you know? But also on that, like, why is a cycle lane bad for business in the first place, you know? But anyway, and sure, then, like, there's a Fianna Fáil Galway City Councillor, John Connolly, who spoke in the council about the benefits of climate change to Galway, because I think it was that we'd have more business, more outdoor seating in the better weather or something. Yeah.
Great. That says it all, really. That's, yeah.
And I suppose just on a national level, like, in terms of our current politicians, like, the climate bill that's been published in the last day or so is, you know, completely inadequate. Like, in terms of the targets of reducing emissions, they're not what the science says that we need, and it's very dubious whether they're actually legally binded to those targets in the first place anyway. It says nothing about LNGs or the importation of fracked gas, nothing about just transition, really, you know. Yeah, and it just kicks the can down the road in terms of reducing emissions. So I wouldn't really have any faith in that either on a national level.
Yeah, that's a comprehensive answer. That's, yeah, I'd be in vast agreement as well. And so finally, then, Adrian, I wanted to ask about illegal dumping, which is an issue of particular concern that's gotten a lot of media attention in the last kind of few months in Galway. What would PPP as an eco-socialist party advocate for as a solution to this? And I actually think for anybody who's not familiar with the situation, it would be useful if you kind of go back to your lack of faith in the current set of politicians we have, just kind of give an example of some of the things that were actually, you know, proposed to solve this.
Yeah, so if you're not in Galway and weren't following the local news here, this might not sound like a weird thing to bring up, illegal dumping, but it really is an ongoing, it's both a real problem in parts of Galway and also an ongoing thing between ourselves and kind of the right in Galway and their proposed solutions to this, which are bizarre, to be honest. We have, you know, local kind of right-wing independents and Fianna Fáil reps, you know, shouting and clamoring for Garda checkpoints and all this kind of stuff, but then also for the city council to buy drones to carry out surveillance on people who are illegal dumping as a supposed solution to this. And like, we just say that yes, illegal dumping is a serious problem, needs to be solved, but these things are just a waste of resources. They're unrealistic and they don't actually address the problem whatsoever, you know. Our argument, I suppose, as socialists is that the privatization of the public service of rubbish collection has, you know, priced people out of the market, put people into the hands of, you know, kind of illegal operators in the rubbish collection market. So basically, privatization has led to an increase in illegal dumping, both in Galway and elsewhere. So, I mean, we just say that bin collection is, you know, it's a vital public service. It might not be a sexy topic, you know, but like it really is. It's no more than water or public transport, as we said earlier. It needs to be provided by the state, not for profit, for the public good. And that is basically a real solution to illegal dumping, not spy drones.
Yeah. It's a bit more boring, I suppose, but it's definitely more common sense, and probably a lot more realistic in terms of actually solving the problem and making some headway on that. But yeah, thanks very much, Adrian, for your your time and your contribution. I think I'll just pop back now, kind of to close out the formal part of the evening here, and kind of pose a question to both Jess and Adrian here. So I was wondering, in terms of looking forward from an eco-socialist kind of point of view and the future of eco-socialism in Ireland, what is the significance of kind of Rise joining PBP and kind of this joining of kind of two very eco-socialist centric forces within Ireland? And are you optimistic about the future moving forward for that? So we might get an answer from Jess first, if that's okay.
Yeah, just unmuting myself there. Yeah, I'm super thrilled to be a part of People Before Profit. Like, I'd start off by saying that. And like, I started off as an environmental activist a long time ago, with like nobody on a corner holding up a sign demanding green jobs. And you know, I got active in Occupy Wall Street and became a socialist and a Marxist, and still the movements weren't getting as big as I knew they needed to be. But like, I think, you know, we're living in an extremely tumultuous period in history with climate change looming, but also there's this growing urgency for women's liberation, for an end to racism, homophobia, transphobia. We can see a huge growth in socialist ideas and movements for radical change. And like, this is the time for the left to come together and find a way to help build the mass working class movements we need, you know, to transform our trade unions into fighting organizations again, and to learn again how to fight capitalism. And like I say learn again, because if you look back in history to the 1960s and before that to the early 20th century, when you had mass socialist and communist movements, revolutions in Latin America and Africa, Portugal, Asia, you can see like how far we've fallen behind and how much more we need to grow and relearn some of the lessons of what we need to do to build our movements, to build coalitions, to debate vigorously about what are the next steps. But we are growing. Like that one little corner that I stood on demanding green jobs with like 5 other people, like just a few years later was 50,000 people showing up for a march. And then a few years later, it's 400,000 people. And then the climate strike, the year before last, I was gonna say last year, but we lost last year. It was 7 million people around the world, you know? Our movements are growing and they're getting more militant. You know, the demands of the environmental movement used to be like get light bulbs and change your car. And now it's system change, not climate change. And it's getting more youthful. I mean, look at Black Lives Matter in the US. Last summer, a majority of Americans said, yes, burn that police station down. I never thought my dad would be like, yes, absolutely. You know, like my dad's not a right winger or anything, but like a lot of people see things like that and they're like, but I mean, a lot of people that I know, people that are not that political, were just like, hell yeah, you know? If you look at like the Kill the Bill movement, I don't know if you would call it that, you know, the movement that erupted around the vigil around Sarah Everard's death, but then connecting that now to kill the bill and not give more repressive powers to the police, erupting in the UK. If you look at Myanmar and like the brave people of Myanmar fighting a military coup, live ammunition, standing up to that. The Haitian people fighting back to remove a government subservient to the US. Like, we need to grow more, we need to debate more, we need to take more steps together. But I'm confident that People Before Profit can help to contribute to building a vibrant socialist movement in Ireland as part of an international movement for an eco-social society. And like, I'd really encourage anybody out there on the Zoom meeting tonight, like if you're not already a member of PBP, join, get your friends and family to join, get your workmates to join, anyone who's left-wing and wants to change society, get them to join with us, because really only by building a movement together, you know, bringing together working class people from all the different communities, rural communities, city communities, students, struggling farmers, bringing all these people together within a party. Only then can we learn the issues that people like feel are the burning issues for them and that they want to change, and we can talk about how we can change that. You know, we can discuss together how best we can accomplish that. How can we build our movements and ultimately fight for an eco-socialist society?
That's fantastic. That's a great rallying cry as well. Future is optimistic, and I thought your point about relearning the lessons from, you know, the early 20th century are, you know, quite profound and something that is actually drastically needed. So thank you very much for that contribution. That was fantastic. Adrian, do you have anything to add to that about looking forward with RISE and PPP joining together?
Sorry about that. Yeah, that was fantastic, and I agree with everything Jess said there. I suppose, as well as the sort of, you know, largely kind of youth movement internationally calling for system change, not climate change, which does give me great hope. There are other things I've been thinking about as well, kind of at a local level, you know, and I guess I feel like lockdown has brought people closer to the kind of environment around them, you know, and I think there are a lot of people doing great work to foster biodiversity, particularly at a local level. You know, there's a campaign group at the moment to get Galway declared a national park city, which would involve like protecting and enhancing all of our green and blue spaces around Galway. You know, making a healthier urban environment for all of us and for the planet, which would be great. And then I have to give a shout out as well to people like Friends of Merlin Woods and the Terryland Forest Park Alliance, who do really fantastic work, like, you know, protecting and enhancing our local environment here in Galway. And yeah, like I said, I just think lockdown has brought all of us, I know it definitely has brought me closer to the environment around us. And I think if we bring that forward along with this sort of, you know, these radical demands for changing the system that Jess touched on, that there is the kernel of something there. But I mean, really, it does have to be married with overthrowing the capitalist system. That is really the bottom line. Like, it's not, you know, we're not going to take on climate change by, you know, having nicer parks in Galway, even though that, you know, is a good thing. So yeah, basically, I would encourage everybody to join People Before Profit, Ireland's eco-socialist party, and help us build something that can really challenge the system, you know. And yeah, I should say as well that if anybody here who is in Galway would like to come along to our branch meeting, it is on Zoom on Wednesday, and we'll be discussing Ireland and the metabolic rift and some other things on Wednesday, if anyone is interested. And if anyone would just like to get in touch with us, maybe the questions I'd like to ask before joining or whatever, if they can find People Before Profit Galway or Adrian Curran on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or whatever. Or, I mean, fire away with your questions and contributions now as well. Thanks, everyone.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for the contribution, Adrian, and thanks to Jess and Adrian for speaking so well and so passionately on some really, really important topics. So I think we've obviously run over a little bit. If people are okay with staying on, we might still get through a few questions. We'll see how we're going with that. So yeah, I guess we'll start with some of the questions from the chat that I've just noticed. I think I can go back to the first one, which was from Inigo, I think. And then if other people wanted to raise their hands and ask a question then as well, we can unmute you too. So the question from Inigo was, what are practical methods for eco-socialist campaigners? So, and then they listed examples of co-ops, largely self-sustaining communities, and civil disobedience. So I think what might be what's being said there is what are the best ways to try and achieve eco-socialist principles and eco-socialist change within society. So I'll put that to the floor, and if Jess or Adrian want to hop in, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I don't encourage people to go start a worker co-op. I don't encourage people to go join a self-sustaining community. Although if that's your thing, go do that for sure. I would encourage people to join a political party like People for Profit. Don't go join something else, join us. if you consider yourself an eco-socialist, and help us build campaigns. If there's a local campaign, like Adrian was talking about, a local campaign around the ring road, or illegal dumping or something like that. There are local campaigns you can get involved around. But also, the eco part of it is really important, but the socialist part of it as well, about, going to the Debenhams pickets and supporting worker struggles is really, really key, because the only way we're going to be able to bring about the change we need in society is to build confidence and organization amongst our communities. And so we need to think about what steps can we take to do that. And it usually starts with local things and talking to your friends, your family, and your neighbors about the issues that they care most about. I don't think going off and doing other, and trying to build a tiny little part of the society you want to see is the way to fight for that new society. I think we have to build the force. That's the working class, us. We have to build that together. And I also would say, if anybody's involved in a trade union, or if you're in a workplace and you're not in a trade union, join a trade union and get active in your trade union to the extent that you can. It's difficult depending on the trade union, and the trade unions need to be transformed. I'm not in any way suggesting their current situation is ideal. But getting involved in the trade unions is really, really important, because the only way we're going to transform them is by workers getting involved and fighting to democratize them and make them the fighting organs we need them to be, so that the Debenhams workers wouldn't have been left out on the pickets by themselves. Mandate actually would have been there with them. Other workers would have been there with them. ICTU would have supported them. We need that. And that will only happen with us joining the trade unions and transforming them. Providing an alternative leadership, providing an alternative strategy for the kind of changes that most workers want in terms of pay and working conditions and things like that. So yeah, I would encourage people to stay and get active in your community and join PVP.
Thanks, that's super comprehensive. I hope that answered Nico's question. Adrian, do you have anything to add to that, or did Jess cover it all?
I think Jess answered it pretty well. Yeah, just get organized in your community, in your workplace. Join PVP if you can.
That's the key takeaway. Yeah. So we move on to another question there. So Damien asked, is the Dutch model of farming, I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with the Dutch model of farming. I'm not actually familiar with the precise specifics. So if nobody is, then we can move past that if neither Adrian or Jess are familiar with it.
I was going to say, the person who asked that would like to say something about it. They might know more about it than we do.
Yeah, Damien, if you wanted to unmute, would that be okay with you, or Yep, do we have Damien there?
Sorry, I put a cat among the pigeons here now. Maybe we should just move on.
Yeah, I've been trying to get into mute. It's just it's like hitting ask to unmute and no response.
Okay, right. Well, we might move on then, especially if we're not precisely familiar with the specifics of that particular model. I'm certainly not anyway. Yeah. Do we have anybody with their hands up? Actually, sorry, while I'm just scrolling through the chat. Anybody who'd like to speak up and ask a question or anything, or oh, Inigo had their hand up there. So Mike, if you could unmute.
I think David put his hand up.
How are you? Thank you very much. This is all wonderful. I'm sort of coming from a minority language campaign group, Mishnach, you might have heard about them, and I'm wondering, just a general question maybe, how does eco-socialism approach traditional communities, be it linguistically or culturally or religiously distinguished, and how do we get them on board with these wonderful ideas, really? Koramagli, thank you.
Great, thanks so much for the question, Inigo. So Jess or Adrian, do you want to take that? Feel free to hop in if you do.
Do you want to answer that, Jess?
No, you can go ahead.
I was actually trying to sort out the other question. I kind of missed it.
Okay, I'll answer it then. I think that's a really good question, because capitalism has meant like trying to homogenize the entire earth, right? And try to destroy other cultures and other ways of like interacting with nature. And indigenous people are like at the front lines of defending nature. So firstly, eco-socialism would absolutely like respect other cultures, and would be a flourishing of other cultures and other languages and other ways of like interacting with nature, as long as it's not destructive. But like, these are not usually destructive cultures that capitalism's looking to eradicate. It's usually looking to eradicate those that are against private property for communal ways of living. So in general, it would be supportive of that kind of thing. And I tend to think when it comes to questions of like national identity, community identity, ethnic identity, and all of that, it's really super important for socialists to support people in their fight for self-determination and their fight to live the way they want to live, and to have the freedom to be who they want to be. That's really important. And so the way you go about that would just depend on the situation that you're in. Every situation is different. Every country and every ethnic minority within those countries are facing different barriers and different issues. But just a general principle would be to assist the fight for self-determination for people that are oppressed.
Great, thanks for that. Inigo, I hope that answered your question. Great question as well, by the way. So yeah, we might move on. We have a few more people with their hands up there. So Damien actually has his hand up now, or has their hand up. If Mike, you want to ask them to unmute. Damien, do we have you there?
Hello.
Hi. Yep, can hear you.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yep.
So yes, Dutch model farming. I don't know all that much about it. From what I know, I mean, if you think about it, the #1 country that exports agricultural foodstuffs is America. The second is the Dutch. And when you think about their landscape, I mean, they have massive problems with flooding, and their country isn't all that big. So for them to be the biggest exporter in the world of agricultural goods is something massive. Basically, they use a system where it's basically greenhouse. So they have all their plants and everything in massive greenhouses, and the water they use the lowest amount of water in growing foodstuff across any other different agricultural growing method of growing. I believe it can also help with geothermal energy. There are lots of ways that it is sort of good and as an alternative, but really my question is sort of around, I'm not really sure how good it is in terms of soil erosion and everything. So my question was just if we were looking to alternatives for traditional farming methods that wasn't so polluting and bad for groundwater and everything, and use of pesticides, would that be a good alternative, or would there be alternatives that maybe Jess or Adrian would know better about? Thank you.
Thanks for that, Damien. That's a really good question as well. You definitely need to think of multiple kind of streams of kind of ways of making sure what you're doing is sustainable. So yeah, I'll put that to either Jess or Adrian, whoever wants to hop in on that point.
It's very interesting. I mean, thanks for that, Damien, first of all. It's something I will look into as you brought it up. I think what I would say about agriculture is that we need to take on and break up the big agribusinesses, you know, your Larry Goodmans, your Glanbias and these people. And by doing so, we need to bring about a just transition for, you know, small farmers. And we very much need to bring, you know, make climate action beneficial for small farmers. There's a lot of impression that you know, climate action is bad thing for rural Ireland, bad thing for farmers. You know, we want to come and take their farms off them and take their cars off them and give them one car for the whole village or whatever. And like, we kind of almost have to prove to people that that's not what we're talking about. We want to help people and make people's lives better by saving the planet, you know. Yeah, sorry, that's what I would say about agriculture in terms of eco-socialism.
That's great. Yeah, good answer. Jess, do you have anything to hop in there with, or has Adrian covered it mostly?
I just say one thing. I don't know anything about the Dutch agricultural model. I was just Googling it there. That's the great thing about being on Zoom. And like, the quick Google isn't going to teach me everything I need to know to answer. But what I would say is one of the questions that I'd have about it is like the impact of their agricultural practices on wildlife and ecosystems. Because just from a cursory look there, it looks like the main thing, and the thing that you mentioned was the export of food, which is super important. We want to feed people, but we already overproduce food. The distribution is the main issue. What we need agricultural to take into consideration, and that's what rewilding and regenerative farming takes into consideration, is ecosystem health and ensuring that you have you know, as high as you can, a biodiverse population of plants and animals and fungi that you need to ensure things are sustainable and resilient. So I'd want to learn a bit about that, as well as how they're able to produce so much food.
Yeah, no, that's definitely stuff you need to think about. I might actually just in reference to that, because this was something I was looking up a little bit ago as well. It was about the uptake of golden rice, which is in theory a very good idea and something that would make farmers' lives a lot easier. But certain farmers in the Philippines argued prior to take up that it actually would need more water to actually to grow it successfully and to get like as good a yield as comparable to the previous, to using non-golden rice. So it's kind of like Adrian's point and then Jess's point about I don't know, making sure it's sustainable and also works. I think that's really important. I'm diverting from my chair duties here. I thought that was interesting anyway. But so we had a couple more questions. So we had a good question in the chat from Georgia there about wondering whether or not anyone could comment on the rise of eco-fascism and what you would say in relation to that. So I'll put that to the floor. So Adrian or Jess, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think it's pretty clear to see to everybody that there is a rise in far right activity in general in Ireland. You know, they're capitalizing on the people's understandable frustrations with the really, you know, ineffectual, indefinite lockdowns. Eco-fascism is an interesting one. I mean, if Georgia wants to come in, please do. But I haven't seen too much evidence of eco-fascism in particular in Ireland. I could be wrong now, I could not be seeing it. But in general, I think what we need to do to combat the rise of, you know, far right is to offer people real solutions to their problems. You know, not these easy kind of get outs, you know, that you know, it's immigrants' fault, or, you know, there's some mad conspiracy behind it. Give them the real explanations and real solutions to their real problems, because especially with this you know, protests against the lockdowns and stuff, it's very easy to see people get dragged into it and get used by the far right operators who are organizing these things. Because I mean, of course people are frustrated with the lockdown and with the government and with the establishment at the moment. It's all been completely shown up over the last year. Why wouldn't they be frustrated with these things? But I do think the left, all of us, need to be very careful with this. We really need to get out into working class communities across Ireland as in a safe way, but we really need to do it, start doing it, to offer real solutions to people, basically. to their frustrations. And that goes for climate, and it goes for anything else, you know. And I suppose climate is going to increasingly, you know, as the effects of climate change get worse and more obvious, it's going to be increasingly a factor in that.
Yeah, that's a comprehensive answer. Thank you very much, Adrian. Jess, do you have anything to comment on that, or has that been covered?
Yeah, I would just say I agree with Adrian. I haven't seen it in Ireland, but we shouldn't be complacent. I agree with what Adrian said in terms of how to address it and try to help ensure it doesn't grow. But you do see the growth of eco-fascist ideas in Europe, like the Christchurch shooting as well in Australia. Like these people like cite climate change and concern about climate change for like really horrific things. But then also when people talk about population, when people talk about, you know, build homes for the Irish, when people talk about, you know, we just don't have enough or whatever, like it creeps towards that. They don't yet use climate change as a reason why we can't accept refugees, but that's very, very, you know, it's just next door to it. So we really have to push back against that. And I agree with Adrian, the thing to do is to, you know, provide an alternative and to show people that it's really possible for us to gain these resources, to build the housing, to provide, you know, to do all the things that people want and need to live good lives. And that it's not a competition that we need to have with the very poorest in society who are fleeing climate change, fleeing war, that we need to blame and we need to let perish. We need to fight for these resources. But we absolutely can't be complacent. We've seen the growth of the far right since with COVID, but also, you know, some of the arguments that are used within the environmental movement also allow the growth of right-wing ideas within them, and we have to combat them within the environmental movement too.
Yeah, great answer, and very just a really important topic as well, to not you know, not be complacent in terms of watching for you know, any hint of fascism and, you know, justification of using climate change to justify those kind of ideas. So yeah, thanks to Adrian and Jess for that. So we might just take 2 more questions now. So Dara's had his hand up for a bit, and I think then Dave Larkin had his hand up as well a little bit ago. I don't see it there now, but we might just, if Dara could be unmuted there and you can ask your question.
Okay, thanks guys. I missed out on some of the start of the meeting, but I have a question, but I also wanted to make a comment. I think your man from Mission made a very good point about, you know, how do you relate eco-socialism to people from the minority language community? And I just wanted to comment on that really quick, that, you know, core to the fossil fuel industry and driving climate change is colonialism. And in the same way, colonialism is also the core of the destruction of the Irish language. Like, but at the same time that was happening, you know, over in Nigeria, oil companies are destroying communities there, destroying languages, funding massacres, that sort of thing. So I think, you know, how do you connect those 2 things? I think, you know, they are a related struggle. It's the struggle against colonialism and capitalism. So I think socialism is how you connect those 2 issues. But the question I wanted to, I just said that because I'm a Gaeilgeoir and I thought I'd make a comment. But the question I have is more, I was wondering if you could both comment maybe on CETA and the EU, because, you know, these big trade deals and stuff, they're, you know, importing massive amounts of beef from Brazil. You know, it's not economical. It's not, it's they're destroying the Amazon to do it. So all these types of trade deals that we have in the West, maybe comment on how they're, I guess, feeding into climate change. And yeah, if you have any comments on that, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Dara. That's a great contribution, and very glad you brought up CETA as well. That's something that's a very, very topical right now. So yeah, so Jess and Adrian, do either of you want to jump in on that point?
I'll let Jess go first this time.
Sure, no problem. I think that's a really good question. Capitalism in its like incessant quest for growth has needed to kind of supersede its own boundaries within countries, a nation state, right? And in order to do that, they like come into conflict with other countries, right? And that's why you have war, because they want to try to like sell their goods in other markets, but like that market's already captured. These trade agreements that like are happening on a global scale are the way for capitalism to kind of like iron out how they're gonna, you know, capture certain markets, get raw materials from here, ensure the supply chains happen. It's super, super important for capitalism's growth and its like sustainability and its profit accumulation that they're able to get these trade deals passed. So it's a big deal whenever working people are able to defeat trade deals and to call them out for what they are, which is, you know, basically the ability for businesses and big corporations to get what they want at our loss, like our loss and nature's loss. But the other point to make in terms of climate change and environmental destruction is that like capital accumulation, the accumulation of profits can only happen if you have the exploitation of workers and you have the destruction of nature. There's no other way. That's how profits are made. You take raw materials from the earth, you have human labor that takes those raw materials and makes them into some product, and then you've got something that you sell to somebody. So you have to have those two things. And these big trade deals make it easier for capital to move around the world to find the cheapest labor to exploit the poorest and most marginalized people on the planet, and also to destroy environment wherever they can, wherever there's the least amount of regulations. And so these trade deals are all about how best they can do that. And they try to write in all these different things to make them sound like they're good, but they're not. Like, I'm not going to talk about the investor courts. I think most people are probably familiar with them. But like overall, the trade deals are necessary for capitalism. It's important for us to fight back against them. And they're also highly, highly destructive to the environment. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks very much for that. Very comprehensive answer. Again, I'm saying that a lot, but I mean it. Adrian, do you have any thoughts as well on CETA?
I think Jess covered CETA there, and we're gone on quite long, so I think we'll just take the last question away.
Yeah, that sounds fine. So is Dave still there, or did Dave have their hand up?
I'm still with you. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes.
Yes, great. This evening, people. But when we had the likes of the ESB money point, they leak for 55,000 tons of CO2 gases into the atmosphere that will last for over 1,000 years. That's equivalent to over 100 million cars of carbon monoxide. What I want to know is, can we call on more whistleblowers to highlight what's going on and to make sure that the state pays all their legal fees? Because without that, they haven't a chance of taking on the likes of the ESB or the HSE or other semi-state companies, or even the banks for that matter. The other thing that was mentioned this evening was plastic. Plastic is the biggest curse in the world today. Rivers, lakes, parks, forests is destroyed with plastic. Our sea is destroyed with plastic. It's actually getting into the fish, and people are actually eating it at the moment. You go into a supermarket, any part of Ireland today, and 80% of the SKUs on the shelf is covered with plastic. What I would like people before profit to do is start calling on a tax on the supermarkets or anyone who sells plastic, covered in plastic, to put a 75% gross tax on the profits. And I believe that would solve a lot of the plastic problems in Ireland within 12 months. The other thing that has been mentioned is electric cars. Electric cars, some people say they're fantastic altogether, but people are not getting the truth about electric cars. They're cleaner. Yes, they are much cleaner. But there's children under 7 years of age who are extracting iron and cobalt from the bogs that is used to make the batteries for those electric cars. Recently, Volkswagen said that it takes 65% more carbon dioxide to make an electric car compared to, or to make a petrol or a diesel car. Sorry, I get mixed up. To make an electric car compared to a petrol or a diesel car. To get the benefits of electric car, you will have to drive 80,000 kilometers. Now, if you look at the average family, they drive maybe 6, 7, 8, or 10,000 kilometers a year. If they have a car for 8 years, would battery last as long as that? The buses, since 2007 to date, we have taken over 500 buses off the streets. As soon as Eamon Ryan got into power, he called to remove more buses off our streets. What we want is the 500 buses back on the streets and double that or treble that so people can walk outside their door, hop on a bus, into town, down the country, across the country. They would leave the car behind. What is your opinion on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Very, very, very interesting.
First time on this.
No, that's fantastic. Two really important points on on plastic and electric cars, and yeah, I'd love to hear the opinions on that. So, Jess and Adrian, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll take some of it anyway. I think I missed an important part of the first question when Dave was talking whistleblowers. I think it cut out for a bit of that, but I totally agree with Dave on electric cars. I mean, they're not really going to be the solution, are they? They're it feels to me like kind of a cop out saying electric cars are the way, like for a whole load of reasons, like what you mentioned about how environmentally destructive they are and the terrible conditions that the workers in the global south who produce the extract the resources needed to make and run electric cars, the way they're treated, like they can be part of the solution, I suppose, but they're not kind of a holy grail by any means, I don't think. I guess, I mean, you touched on yourself what the solution is. It's, increased buses and public transport generally. I think electrified buses would probably be a good thing. And, along with expanding the rail network and light rail and all of that. But yeah, certainly I don't think just replacing all of the petrol and diesel cars that we have now, one for one with electric cars, I definitely don't think that's something we should be in favor of.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you. Thanks very much for that. And then Jess, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with a lot that Dave said. I'm not sure about the gross tax. I'd have to think more about that, about plastic, just because I never heard of it before. But I fully agree with Dave. Like, you go into a supermarket and like you're just inundated with plastic. You come home and like all your produce, and the plastic's not recyclable. Oh, it drives me nuts. So I really, really agree. Just one thing I'd add about plastic in the ocean, like I think people are mistaken in terms of like plastic in the ocean being the plastic that we find on our produce. It's not. The main plastic that you find in the ocean comes from industrial fishing. It comes from industrial fishing gear. I'm not in any way suggesting that like we shouldn't care about the plastic in the grocery stores. We absolutely should. But like also that is a big issue as well. You probably would have seen some dolphins that were washed up ashore and basically died because their tails were wrapped in fishing gear, in plastic fishing gear. So it's a big issue. I agree about the whistleblower thing. I think anything we can do to assist whistleblowers to come forward is super, super important. We need to support people when they call out the crimes of corporations and ensure that they are fully supported in whatever way we can. I agree with Dave in terms of ensuring that they have, defense lawyers, all those things. I don't know all the laws in Ireland. I've only been here 4 years, but I absolutely support those things. On public transport, again, I fully support what Dave is suggesting. One of the things that we say is we need free, green, and frequent public transport, because if it's not frequent, then people will not be able to get out of their cars. And like Adrian mentioned before about women and having to run all the errands, go to the GP, drop the kids to school, all of that, like, you need flexibility, and you don't feel like the bus is something that you can rely on. You got kids with you, you know what I mean? So we need to envision a transport system that supports workers. The whole climate mitigation plan that the government came out with a year or two ago was wholly reliant on electric vehicles, and they are unable to get an uptake. People are not buying them at the rate that they were hoping. And also I would point out that it's a huge waste of government funding, like our taxpayer money, to be giving people grants so they can go buy a personal electric vehicle. It'd be much, much better to invest that in electric buses, you know, and to put the buses onto the roads instead of the electric vehicles, to invest in more light rail. I don't know if you call it light rail. I would call it light rail because I'm American, but like, you know what I mean? Like Lewis's, that kind of thing. Metro links, whatever you want to call them, trains, you know, we need more of that as well. So that people, you know, feel like they can actually step away from their personal car use. I think that's everything you mentioned. That was a great contribution though.
Thank you. Thanks for the answers as well. I hope that covered it, Dave, and thanks very much for the very, very important contribution and some great questions. So with that, I think we might leave it there. Unfortunately, I see an Ego has their hand up as well. I'm sorry. I think we should cut it there just because we've run. This is only supposed to be 45 minutes, so we've run quite a bit over. So thanks very much to Adrian and Jess for staying on with us and for answering questions and for their contributions. And thanks very much to everybody who came along and contributed and asked some really fantastic questions. So I think it's been spammed in the link or in the chat already about joining PPP, but please do consider joining PPP if you're not already a member, because these are the kind of discussions that we're really passionate about having and the movements we're passionate about supporting. So Adrian's just put it in there. So yeah, thanks again to everybody. And as Adrian mentioned, next week at our branch meeting, our local branch meeting, we'll be discussing the metabolic rift, which I think is a really interesting topic as well. So if you like this, then I hope you consider joining and everything. So yeah, thanks again, everybody. And I think we'll leave it there.
Thanks, Shane, and thanks, Jess. And thanks everyone for coming. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording.
Great. Thanks so much again, everybody, for coming.